Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ICT's podcast series during the COVID pandemic. I'm Itai Hanman, and this is Counter-Terrorism today. And joined with me now over Zoom chat, as we are unable to be in studios yet, but back here in our homes over Zoom chat, we have Mr. Naftali Granot. He's an associate at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism and the former deputy director of the Mossad here in Israel. Mr. Granot is a former senior Mossad operative. He retired in 2007 after over 25 years of active field service, and as the former head of the Humanit division and the deputy director of the Mossad. Mr. Granot, how are you doing today?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us right now during this pandemic on our podcast series, discussing how the COVID-19 has affected national security apparatus, how COVID-19 has affected the fight against terrorism, the fight against the enemies of the state. And so we turn to you to discuss the situation vis-a-vis Iran. As we know, it's been called the war between wars. It's been called the shadow war. Many different comments used to discuss the conflict between Israel and Iran. Very little direct engagement, but we have seen some engagement on the Syrian border inside Syria. And during this COVID-19 pandemic, it does not seem that Iran has slowed down its goals of establishing a forward base inside Syria. But before we get into those types of details, Mr. Granot, can we ask you what your assessment is of Iran during this COVID-19 time, as they are under heavy sanctions from the United States? They are one of the hardest hit countries due to this pandemic, with 120,000 reported cases and over 7,000 reported deaths thus far. How does that affect their military goals going forward?
Okay. So Iran is greatly affected by COVID-19, the virus, in various ways. First of all, we have as a background the American sanctions, which are biting the Iranian economy for more than a year by now. But on top of that, the fact that Iran had to actually shut down most of its economic activity during the pandemic, and to a certain extent the situation still exists till now, added to the economic pains of Iran. If you take into consideration also the fact that the price of oil has completely collapsed during the recent few weeks, and the fact that European and other banks are reluctant to give Iran any loans, that adds to a total economic disaster for them. And as a result, Iran is actually facing a major challenge, a major economic challenge that affects its internal and external politics.
And when you look at its external politics, what do you think is being severely affected the most?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that Iran is not going to retreat from Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq. It won't happen. Although several reports were published recently in the Israeli press indicating that Iran has withdrawn its forces from central Syria, I would call it sort of redeployment exercise in order to give them better protection from Israeli air raids. But generally speaking, one must understand that the support that Iran is giving to Lebanon, to Syria, and to Iraq is something very fundamental and basic that is derived from the nature of the regime. So they will keep supporting and backing the Shiite regimes, and for that sake, Syria is a sort of a Shiite regime, and they are not going to let it down. If somebody understood wrongly the reports about the withdrawal from central Syria, it's not the case. Iran continues and will continue in the foreseen future. I would even dare say for as long as the current regime is still in place, I don't see a situation that they can let go of their support to Iraq or Syria. So Iran is still a strategic threat to Israel in various ways. Maybe the biggest strategic challenge to Israel, and it will continue to be so also in the foreseen future.
And so, if they are not willing to relinquish their goals of the Shiite crescent between Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, and their path to the Mediterranean, if you will, how much resources do they have to devote then to this? As you explained, they are bitten extremely hard by the US sanctions. They've been severely affected by the price of oil as it has dropped, as you mentioned, significantly, down to even negative $37 at one point per barrel. What resources do they have left to fund these adventures outside of Iran, especially when so many people inside the country are dying? And how is that going to affect the balance when they try to convince the public that they need to be in Syria, that they need to be giving money to Hezbollah, that they need to be building missile bases on the border of Iraq and Syria?
Well, Iran will definitely have to scale down its financial support to its allies out of Iran, as it did, for instance, with Hezbollah. And it was several Shiite fractions in Iraq. No doubt that it will not be able to maintain the level of support it did before the coronavirus crisis and before the American sanctions. That's clear. But they will find, and they still find, the right balance between maintaining their support externally in order to help Iran become a regional power, as stated in the vision, and the internal needs of the population. So it's a matter of trying to balance between the two things. No doubt that they will have to scale down the amount of money that they are spreading around, but they will maintain their support, the military support to these groups. No doubt about it.
And since that there are so many groups, as you mentioned, they have scaled down for Hezbollah, but there are so many groups that they support, be it Shiite militias in Iraq that they have brought over also into Syria, but they also support what's going on in Yemen. And how will COVID-19 affect their fight in Yemen, their proxy war with Saudi Arabia?
One must remember that more than 50% of the Iranian economy is held by the Revolutionary Guard's economic companies. So actually, the Revolutionary Guards who are in charge of that support to countries out of Iran, out of their economic well-being, and the money that they have accumulated over the years, will continue some level of support to these groups. I don't see a realistic situation whereby they will stop completely financing those organizations. It will definitely be on the account of the Iranian people, because the Iranian regime will not be able to sustain or maintain the support it's already giving to the vast population, because the main source of economic revenues, the oil, actually has dropped down dramatically due to the sanctions and the drop in the price of oil. So if you ask me, I mean, from an overview perspective, Iran will continue for as long as this regime exists with its support to neighboring Shiite communities out of Iran, namely Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And at the same time, one needs to bear in mind that Iran is still investing money, even nowadays, in promoting its nuclear program and its missile program, including involvement in the missile accuracy program for Hezbollah. So from all this, one can conclude that for the foreseen future, Iran will be still our major or strategic enemy.
And you brought up the very interesting part about the missiles that Iran is continuously developing, both for itself but also for Hezbollah. We read a recent report that there was a base built in northeastern Syria near the Iraq border where they are able to build an underground missile development and holding facility that they hope to potentially transfer missiles to Hezbollah from there. One thing that we have seen maybe over the last 6 to 8 months or even a year is that Iran is sort of pushing its forces and its development, research and development facilities further north, closer to the Iraq border, even into Iraq and away from Damascus or the Syrian-Israeli border in the Golan Heights area. What do you think has changed in their thinking to move these types of locations and facilities more to the Iraqi border? Does that make them less vulnerable to potential Israeli or American strikes?
Actually, the aim of moving those facilities to eastern Syria, nearby the Iraqi border, is exactly for trying to give them better protection from Israeli raids. But as we all understand, it will not dramatically affect Israeli air raids on these facilities once they are discovered, because Israel has the means to strike far beyond the border between Syria and Iraq, namely the F-35 aircraft can reach there easily without being detected. So they're trying to improve their defenses. They're trying to actually hide those facilities underground, but they will still be exposed to Israeli raids. It will not eliminate the Israelis' air power superiority.
And we haven't had a chance to really speak about it, nor have I brought it up in this interview yet, but the death of Sulemani, the former head of the IRGC, what effect do you think that has had on Iran's goals of establishing itself in the region on the border with Israel?
It definitely had a major influence or effect on Iran's activity out of Iran, namely in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, because he was a very charismatic figure, and he actually, by his own personality, managed to deliver what his predecessors were not able to achieve. And I think to a certain extent, there is no doubt that the fact that he passed away will affect their deployment, will affect some of their activities. But luckily enough for them, from their point of view, his elimination comes after the major victory in the civil war in Syria. So the main goal of protecting the Assad regimes was already achieved before he was removed.
And another interesting report that has come out as we were speaking about how Iran is about supporting allies or people that they, or groups that they feel will be helpful towards their end goals. And obviously one of those groups, one of those entities is the Palestinians. They try to support them, even if from a perspective of just to disrupt Israeli day-to-day life. And what we have seen recently come out of the Iranian parliament was a bill obviously speaking about how they are not having any relations with Israel, et cetera, et cetera. However, there was a point made that they are going to establish a consulate or an embassy in Jerusalem for their relations with Palestine, quote unquote. Now, A, are they even able to do such a thing inside Jerusalem? And B, if they do, what type of provocation does that actually create towards Israel?
I don't see how it can materialize. I think this is political bragging of certain politicians in the Iranian parliament. I don't see how they can actually create such a facility in Jerusalem. They will continue to support the Palestinian cause, definitely, but they won't have as much money as they did in the past. So if they have to choose out of their priorities, the Palestinians are not necessarily in a high priority. So I believe that the Iranian economic crisis will also affect the level of the degree of military support to the Palestinians, on top of the fact that Israel and Egypt have managed together to seal off Gaza relatively good. So to sum it up, I don't think that the Iranian influence in our immediate region, and namely Israel, Gaza Strip, is going to be increased, not at all.
That's interesting to look at. And as we look towards Iran and their fight against COVID-19, we also hear about propaganda that they are spreading, that there was a special virus created by the US just to affect Iran. That type of propaganda is very dangerous on many levels, not just for obvious sakes of their enemy and they're trying to rally against their enemy, but to spread that type of propaganda about this disease. What type of effect will that have on the public of Iran when it comes to their respect for their government, and thus, I guess, the stability of that government, as we have seen since 2009, several flare-ups of the civilian population rise up against their government?
Well, maybe this is a good example or good indication that they are under pressure and they want to strengthen their support from the people inside Iran by spreading rumors and lies about the United States and who is in charge of the ordeal and the suffering of the Iranian people. This is exactly aimed to internal consumption. Nobody outside of Iran believes these lies, but to the base of their support in Iran, the religious sectors in Iran, it will help, in a way, in their view, rally support to the Iranian regime. But out of Iran, it will have no effect whatsoever.
Correct, and I agree with you on that wholeheartedly. Do you think, though, that if the Iranian people, who, in my opinion, are quite a smart nation, capable nation, they understand what's going on around them and try to access the outside world, when they realize their government has been lying to them about this, do you think that this is their chance to rise up? And if they do, what type of support should the outside world give them?
Well, actually, the situation even before the coronavirus was pretty bad, economically speaking, in Iran. Nowadays, after the outbreak of the disease, I think that the high level of unemployment, the high level of corruption, the total dependence on oil, which has been hit very hard, the inequality in the society between those who have and those who don't have. Sorry.
No problem.
All of it will actually incite the population. It will actually increase the level of resistance to the present regime. And at a certain point, the combination of the sanctions and the virus effects and so on will pose a major challenge to the regime. I mean, they cannot go on forever. I mean, now they managed to hide the real situation from their population, from the outside world. But on the long run, they are in a dead-end situation because the suffering will just increase. And at a certain point, we might see the resumption of demonstrations and people will take to the streets. No doubt about it. It's just a matter of time.
And before we let you go, Mr. Granot, thank you so much for your time here. Wanted to ask you, because it's something that was concerning. We saw at the end of April, Iran send up a military satellite into space. They used a ballistic missile that could potentially house a nuclear warhead one day on it if it wanted to. By all accounts and reports, this ballistic missile was a 3-round missile with liquid and solid fuel, and different 3 major stages, which is a breakthrough in their ballistic missile program. If this is to be believed and that they have mastered this technology in some way, what type of threat does this pose to Israel, the Middle East as a whole, frenemies of Israel such as Saudi Arabia, and obviously US interests in the region?
Well, I don't think that this particular launch of a missile to orbit is a major change or anything significant in their progress with their missile program. I think it's more of a propaganda event. It doesn't actually reflect or prove any extraordinary technical capabilities. It was a very simple missile that was launched into orbit with no control systems, no sophisticated cameras. So this is something that so many countries already done it in the past. It doesn't indicate a significant shift or change from what we already know about their missile program. No doubt that the combination of the nuclear program and the advance of the missile program is posing a strategic threat against Israel and the neighboring countries. And that's why they continue to invest so many efforts in these fields. But this particular launch of a missile, surface-to-surface missile that was actually modified and a little bit upgraded to be launched to orbit the Earth, is not a significant achievement in my view.
Oh, that's excellent. That should alleviate some fears of some people. And as we wrap up our conversation, one thing that needs to be mentioned is that Israel continues to fight on its behalf vis-a-vis Iran and what is going on their establishment of forward bases in Gaza and in Syria, Lebanon. COVID-19 has affected Israel in many ways, obviously. And one thing we saw in the first 6-8 weeks of the pandemic is a slowdown in Israeli reported activity vis-a-vis Syria. However,
that was a temporary reduction of attacks against them, but as you know, as you've seen in the last few weeks, in 2 weeks, there were a lot of raids against the infrastructure in Syria. One has to say also that as a result of what we have described on the effect of the virus on the Iranian economy and the redeployment in Syria, that the chances of a major escalation in Syria has decreased now. It's not increased, it's decreased, because Iranians cannot risk or afford themselves a full-blown military confrontation with Israel under the present circumstances. So the level of tension is actually going down as a result of the side effect of the coronavirus.
Well, that's excellent to hear, and we're very pleased that the IDF is still able to operate accordingly, and the Israeli national security apparatus is still operating accordingly. Mr. Granot, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us and discuss this very important issue. For any of our listeners that came in the middle of our conversation, Mr. Naftali Granot is an associate at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism here at the IDC in Herzliya, and is the former deputy director of the Mossad here in Israel. Mr. Granot, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule and enlightening us and giving us a very well-rounded explanation to what is happening with Israel and its enemies.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye-bye.